In the last European report 1 month ago, we were still shaken by the brutal Russian aggression to Ukraine. And we discussed which kind of war we were about to see, which world we will see after hopefully the end of the world. And overall, how this will affect the Middle East, how this will affect Israel, and how this will affect the EU in Israel relations. I'm Marco Gombacci, and this is the European Report. Today, from the European Parliament, I'm joined by Mr. Antonio López-Istúriz White, member of the European Parliament and President of the European Parliament delegation to the Israeli Knesset. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I'm joined by Daniel Schwammenthal from the Transatlantic Institute. Welcome. And of course, I'm joined by Tomas Sandell, European Coalition from Israel. So I'm just back from Ukraine. I passed in Ukraine like 10 days. I stayed in Lviv. That was relatively calm, but when I arrived, they bombed the airport. I moved in another city. They bombed the other city, Lusk. I've seen the desperation. I see a lot of sufferance, but I see a lot of other people willing to fight and to defend their countries, because also they receive some weapons and they receive some help from Western countries and Europe. In the last European report, we discussed what the European Union could do to help Ukrainian resistance and how the European Union can help Ukraine. Did the European Union do enough to help Ukraine, or we can do more, Mr. Lopez?
Never enough. Never enough, because the Ukrainians are fighting for us. We are the main course in Putin's menu. Democracy, European democracy, and the Ukrainians are giving a fight, for our values, our democracy, that for so long Europeans we gave for granted. Now it's a wake-up call to us Europeans. First reaction has been good: unity, coordination, European spirit, but this has to continue. True, we also send financial aid since 2014, since the invasion of Crimea. Billions of euros have gone to Ukraine. And since the war started, nearly 1 billion euros have been given in financial aid, especially military weapons and so on. But of course, the Ukrainians are asking for more. They are resisting, contrary to all expectations, to the almighty Russian army. So we have to be there for them. And until now, I think that we have reacted well, but this will continue. I don't know when this will end. And when the war ends, the tragedy will continue. There are millions right now of refugees, people that we have to take care, not only in Europe, but in the borders. Also, for example, things that no one speaks about: sexual predators, human trafficking mafias are acting right now in the borders. We have to be not tough. We have to eradicate these kind of things, and we have to invest and to work on that.
And do you think that the European Union can increase the sanctions against Russia?
We have to. We have to, until they understand finally that economically they will never beat the European Union. We are far more bigger, stronger, because liberal democracies, they have stronger economies than regimes and dictatorships. We are suffering, of course, and we will suffer the consequences, but we have to be strong. Our future depends on that. If our future is going to be a democratic one, sometimes people complain, slow decisions, imperfect democracy, when people today look for magical solutions in 1 second, that we all know they don't exist. I refer to the populism, which has been financed and supported by Putin for many years to destabilize this European democracy. These are the things that we have to think about.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Daniel, which kind of war are we seeing? And which world we will see after, hopefully, the end of the world? It's going to be like a sort of new Cold War, a new global order, or something different, something else?
difficult for me to say what kind of war we are seeing, and I think a lot of military experts were absolutely surprised and taken aback, as Tono just explained, about the ability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves and the almost shocking weaknesses that the Russian army shows. But I think if we look at the history of the recent history of Russia's aggressions in the region, I don't think we are already at the end of it. I think this will continue. I'm not so sure if we necessarily see a new Cold War. I think we probably never really got out of it. This whole idea of the end of history, the idea that we already see or have a rules-based international order, well, unfortunately, we don't have that. We have it here in certain democratic pockets in Europe, in the United States, and so forth. But we have learned, and particularly Germany has now learned, that human nature has not changed, unfortunately, and that we cannot be naive. We cannot simply rely on the kindness of strangers, but we have to be able to defend ourselves if we want to avoid war. And in that context, I agree also that on the one hand, I'm very positively surprised about the strength of our response. I feared we would not show this kind of unity, so I'm very happy about it. But of course, the question: can we do more? Yes, of course. And you know, if you ask the Ukrainians, there's much more that we could do. There's of course a question of sanctions on energy imports from Russia, despite our existing very tough sanctions. At the same time, we are giving Russia, I think, about $1 billion every day in terms of energy imports and thus helping funding this war. So this has to be on the table. And we also have to signal, I think, to Russia already now that we will stay together and that we will not, maybe, hopefully, if there is a ceasefire, not go back to the old habits of saying, okay, now there's a ceasefire, let's re-engage. We can only re-engage if Russia leaves all territory of Ukraine. So we already need to also signal that we are in this for the long haul, because Putin certainly is.
Yeah, also because some other European countries are a bit scared, because if Russia doesn't stop in Ukraine, they will continue in the Baltics, in Poland, in Finland. So there is this need to maintain the unity of the Western countries. They need to maintain the unity of Europe. And this is what also many Ukrainians told me when I was there. They were expecting more help, probably more sanctions, and probably also the sanctions started to work, because Russia a few days ago said that the focus is not anymore to take the entire Ukraine, but the focus is on Donbass. We have to believe them or not. This is another question. But Tomas, one thing that it impressed me is that when I crossed the border from Ukraine to go to Poland, I saw many NGOs helping the refugees arriving on the Polish soil, on the European soil. And I see a lot of flags of nations, but the biggest flag was the one from Israel, that underlined the role of Israel also in helping the refugees. But can you tell us more about the role also of Israel in the negotiations, in the peace talks? What is the role of the Israeli government, the Israeli state, to reach peace and to make peace between two countries like Ukraine and Russia?
Well, thank you, Marco. It's first of all good to have you back from Ukraine, and I thought when you mentioned flags that you would say the Finnish flag, but you said the Israeli flag, and both of them, of course, are dear to me. So I'm happy to hear about the visibility of Israeli NGOs. I also know that looking at World Jewry, I happen to have good contacts with the World Jewish Congress, and I know for them there is only one issue on the table right now, and this is the humanitarian crisis. So the World Jewish community is really doing a lot to step in and help. But as you mentioned, there's also a role for the state of Israel, and we have to well, let's also say that there are other candidates to be this apostle of peace. There's our own president, Sauli Niinistö, Erdogan has played a role, and Emmanuel Macron would like to play a role. But I think there are two reasons why Israel is, there are certain expectations on Israel. One is, of course, that we have to remember that the Russian minority in Israel is today very significant. We are talking about perhaps 20% of the population, which are Russian speakers. You also have in Russia and the world Jewish community people with influence who are close to Putin, but many of them dual citizenship or a special closeness to the Jewish community. But also geopolitics, of course, and I mean it's a fact today that Russia is Israel's northern border, and that also puts Israel in a very delicate situation where they have to find a balancing game. On the one hand, not to come in a collision course with Kremlin, but on the other hand, of course, show firmness to join these Western sanctions. And I think Israel is playing a very constructive role, and I'm happy that President Zelensky is putting such a trust in the government of Israel. It means, and this would open up a completely new discussion, but it means that Israel today has the trust both in the West, here in Brussels, in Washington, but also in Moscow. Let's hope that out of these negotiations would come something very quickly, and that's really our prayer, and God forbid that this war would continue or that it would escalate.
And how this war will change the priority in the Middle East? Because we have seen at the same day that Biden was in Poland, there was Blinken going to the Middle East to have some talks with some president, prime minister of Middle East countries. So how does it change also the relationship with Europe, Middle East and Israel?
Yeah, I think there is this, what I would call critically perhaps a double talk. You know, on the one hand, we expect our allies in the Middle East to restrain Russia here in Europe. But on the other hand, what is going on simultaneously in Vienna is to empower Russia. We are putting our trust into Russia, playing a key role in the nuclear talks, and also what seems to be on the table now, enable Russia then to trade freely with Iran, which would paradoxically strengthen both Russia and Iran at the same time. So I think there's a certain level of confusion. Where is the US today? And of course, the EU and the US, you know, they're coordinating a lot their efforts in the Middle East. And that's perhaps also the theme for another program. Again, the nuclear talks in Vienna, and what are the ramifications also for Europe.
Thank you.
May I react
Please.
to some comments that, first of all, Tomas knows that I would support dearly a mediator like Sauli Niinistö, a good friend and a long-standing president of Finland, and he has the political personality for this kind of operation. I would rely on that, if that was the case. Said so also about the question of Israel. 20,000 Ukrainian refugees have been coming to Israel, the largest reception from outside the European Union. This has to be taken into account. Also, the humanitarian aid, hospitals that are built by Israel in the borders, in Lviv, and I'm sure that more will come. I think that, this is outstanding. Geostrategically, of course, Israel is a country that is always under threat and has to take account very carefully, the government of Bennett, like many other governments in Israel, how to choose, its position strategically, depending, we know how many enemies are surrounding Israel. So it is understandable in this geostrategical position. About Daniel, about the question of, I agree absolutely with you. I think that we are in a continuation, unfortunately. We lived the happy 80s and 90s in Europe and in the Western world. We thought after the fall of the Berlin Wall that this struggle was over. It's back. Maybe with different actors. Be careful with China after Russia, what will be coming. But in the meantime, we are assisting, sorry to say, in the global context to a regional conflict, like it was before Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Hungary. Now we have Ukraine, and this is again the clash between two visions of the world, the democratic one and the authoritarian one. We have to have clear what is our position in this, what is our place in this. And as Europeans, I have it very clear, my political group has it very clear, many political groups here, some of them still I have some doubts. They prefer a more authoritarian way of doing things, including in Europe. We have to beat them democratically. Also to see, what has been the support and finance by people like Putin to these destabilizing factors inside our democracies. Democracies sometimes, we know they're weaker because, we are open societies. We are open. We are not controlled like the Soviet system, like Putin's systems. We have to be, our struggle is tougher. Sometimes we are fighting with our hand strung in our back. But we are doing, for the freedom. And nowadays we always think about ourselves. Let's think about our children, our grandchildren. What is the future we will leave them? The future that our grandfathers and fathers left us is an incredible European Union that has put to centuries of killings and fightings in Europe. What are we going to leave our children? Are we thinking egoistically or about this future?
Yeah. Correct, and you say something very, very interesting, that you remind that Israel is a country that is permanently under threat. And what I'm saying that sometimes I see some opinionist or professor in some European television that since the beginning of the war they were asking the Ukrainians to surrender. With the same mentality, probably Israel will not exist anymore because they would have asked the Israeli to surrender immediately, while it's important for the liberal democracies to help also other countries to respect certain values and to promote certain values. And still speaking about Israel and also the European geopolitical shift, because it was a huge shift, the fact that for the first time the European Union decided to finance weapons to a third state. This can be the starting point also for a closer military cooperation between the European Union and Israel, for example, in speaking especially about research, innovation in military equipment, weapons, Daniel?
Well, we know, of course, that there are already very close relationships between individual member states and Israel. Israel is also a very appreciated NATO partner. And we know that Germany, which has now announced to beef up its military, is considering for its missile defense the Israeli Arrow system. So I think it would make absolute sense to deepen these existing security and military relationships. Israel has much to offer. Israel is a like-minded country, and both sides would and could only benefit from closer cooperation.
You are from the Transatlantic Institute. Some comment about the words of Biden that he did in Poland, calling Putin a butcher, and especially letting understand that probably Biden would like to have a regime change after the Department of State and the spokesperson of the White House say that the US doesn't want a regime change. But what are your thoughts working for a Transatlantic Institute?
Look, I don't think we should dwell too much on words that certainly in principle I would absolutely agree with. Long term, as I said earlier, what we need to do is to stand firm, to support the Ukrainians with everything we can in terms of supplying military equipment, financial aid, and sanctioning Russia, and really showing this kind of unity. That will hopefully contribute to a change of behavior. If we can bring about a change of regime, fantastic. But I think if we can bring about a change of behavior in Moscow, that would already be a great achievement for our collective security. And I believe we need to do more to underline our existing NATO partnership. And I think the steps that Germany is taking are absolutely right. I think we need to definitely beef up our presence also on the eastern flank, so that there is really zero doubt in Moscow that Article 5 is not just a line on a piece of paper, that it really means something in order to really deter the worst possible scenarios. We don't want to fight a war, but in order to make sure that we don't fight, we have to show that we are ready to do it. It's this paradox which the Romans already and the old Greeks realized. Human nature hasn't changed. If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah, that's a historic perspective, a correct historic perspective.
I would like to tell Mr. Biden that what he should do is to help the democratic forces in Russia. That's what we all should be
That's
doing.
a good point.
There is still hope. There are people fighting for democracy inside Russia. Alexei Navalny and so many others that died by poisoning, that are in prison, thousands of Russians. Instead of confusing declarations, let's give our clear now support to the democratic opposition in Russia, so that the next elections, they win and they change. And we help Russia in this, because there are many, many Russians that I know they are pro-European, that I know also that they are Democrats. Let's help them. That would be far more constructive. That would be the best declaration he could make.
And do you think this is a very good point, helping the democratic parties in Russia and helping the civil society of Russia that wants to look more to the Western than to the past areas? Do you think that there is also some part of the establishment in Russia that are looking for peace, that are looking for a change, a political change in Russia? I'm speaking also about the economic establishment or also the military establishment, for example.
Yes, of course. Of course. we are always talking about the Russians. Let me tell you, I'm not an expert on Russia, but I know many Russians. Not all of them are pro-Putin. Not all of them. They are Democrats by heart. They had a taste after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it was too quick of a real democracy. Maybe we should also think, what did we do wrong? Mm-hmm. We did not maybe help that democratic process in Russia. We were too eager to make business, European, Americans, and not to help solidify the democratic principle that so desperately, for centuries, many Russians have looked for. That could be one of the topics of reflection, food for thought for all of us, how we can also, overcome this situation in Russia.
Yes, that's correct. Thomas, so what's your thought about that?
Yes, again, I'm speaking as a Finn, and we have a certain experience of the same eastern border. What I'd like to bring in, I think, talking about self-reflection, is also to look at the last 20 years, where there at any point an overreach from the West. I know Henry Kissinger, if you read him from 2014, he has very clear ideas of what is the place of Ukraine in Europe. And I would just, again, looking at the example of Finland, it took us 50 years to gradually become part of the West. There were no quick moves that could be misinterpreted on the other side. As much as I believe in a firm defense of Ukraine and the values that we all believe in, I'm also a realist. I live close enough to Russia to know that we can't have wishful thinking. We have to ask us the question, if Russia doesn't go in a democratic development for the next 25, 30 years, how do we deal with it diplomatically? And I think this is the time where we need diplomats like Henry Kissinger and others, because the world is not an ideal world, or it doesn't look the way that we would like for it to look. And here again, coming back to your friend, Mr. Lopez, our president, we are so grateful to have a capable president in this situation. I think there's a lot to be learned from the Finnish experience, Austria for that matter, maybe Switzerland. And I think looking at Europe, I don't think the answer is a completely polarized Europe where you have as many borders between NATO and and Russia as possible. But you know, there is a room also for a certain neutrality. Saying this, I know that my government is probably in the process of applying for NATO membership, so things change, but we shouldn't overreact. We should really, you know, take time to reflect at where
realist,
we are. Yeah, I'm the school of the realists. Yes.
Is it correct, this approach? Is this the realistic approach, the approach to reach peace and to help also Ukrainian, Daniel?
Well, I mean, to be realist is always, I think, the right approach. We have to deal with the reality on the ground. The question then is, what do we do with our analysis? What is once we have assessed the situation? And I can only underline that, you know, as it now appears that much of Europe has realized that the idea that, you know, all governments around the world pursue more or less the same ideas as our democratic governments. That I think this sort of naive approach that ultimately if we engage with them, they will become more like us and we can thus solve, you know, aggressive regimes. You know, I think this has been now clearly proven as wrong, and so we have to stand firm. I don't think we can be neutral. I don't think, you know, if the Finnish approach or the Finnish experience comes from a very concrete historic perspective, but I don't think that this ought to be the model for Europe. We cannot be neutral. Finland didn't have any other choice. We have other choices, we have other means, and we have to prepare for a long confrontation that we have so far pretended didn't exist.
Yeah, very interesting. We have 1 minute left. One last comment from Mr. Lopez. Apparently, Russia didn't veto any accession of Ukraine to the European Union. One very quick comment.
Ukraine, it's a democratic country. No one has to veto anything. No one has to give any opinion. Ukraine, that is my sense of democracy, is the owner of its own destiny. That is what democracy is about. What the majority of the population in Ukraine will decide is the future for Ukraine. That's what I defend, and I hope that, and I know that the ones we are sitting here, and mostly in Europe, we defend.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, and we will see next month, hopefully in a peace time when the peace will be reached. Thank you again.